The wind was a blade, slicing through the thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Eleanor huddled on the splintered bench, the cold seeping into her bones like venom. The station was a desolate box of shadow and drafty corners, smelling of coal smoke, damp wood, and the faint, lingering scent of desperation. It clung to her, she knew, as surely as the grime on her worn dress and the exhaustion etched around her eyes. She was 54, though hardship had aged her face beyond her years, leaving lines like cracks in dry earth. A widow twice over, her second husband's debts had stripped her bare, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a one-way ticket to nowhere, which had expired 3 days ago. Hunger gnawed, a dull, constant ache. Fear was a sharper tooth, the fear of the unknown, of the judging eyes of the few travelers who passed through this forgotten outpost, of the gnawing certainty that she was utterly alone and adrift in a world that had no place for her. Her hands, gnarled from years of toil, trembled not just from cold, but from a profound weariness that went soul-deep. She watched the tracks, shimmering lines that led only away, and felt a crushing weight descend, heavy with the unspoken question. What now? Where was dignity when reduced to this? Where was the woman she had been, capable and proud? Swallowed by circumstances, leaving only this husk. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, pulling the shawl tighter, bracing herself for the pity or contempt she had come to expect. She didn't look up, focusing on the worn toes of her boots. A moment of silence stretched, thick with his presence. He didn't move on. Hesitantly, she raised her gaze, her eyes, once a vibrant blue, now clouded with fatigue and despair. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and stoic, etched by sun and wind. His eyes, surprisingly light against his tan skin, held a quality she couldn't decipher, not pity, not judgment, but a quiet, assessing regard that felt strangely unsettling. He wasn't dressed like the few businessmen who occasionally passed through, nor did he have the rough look of a typical ranch hand. There was a quiet competence about him, a self-possession that spoke of a life lived outside the easy paths. He held a worn leather bag and a rifle was slung over his shoulder. He looked directly at her, past the dirt and the tired lines, past the years. And then he spoke, his voice low, not unkind, but with an undeniable note of certainty, of decision. "You're coming with me," it wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to making up his own mind and seeing things through. The words hung in the air, incongruous and startling. Eleanor stared at him, her mind struggling to process the abrupt, impossible declaration. Confusion warring with a primal fear. Was this a threat? A cruel joke? Had her despair been so visible it had attracted this stranger? I don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't elaborate, simply extended a large, calloused hand. "There's nothing for you here," he said, his gaze steady. "My place is a day's ride. You can come or you can stay and wait." The implied alternative was stark, brutal in its honesty. Waiting here meant waiting for the end, for starvation, for the harsh realities of a world that discarded the vulnerable. He saw it, she realized. He saw her predicament with a clarity that few others possessed, or perhaps few cared to acknowledge. Still, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Who are you?" she asked, searching his face for any hint of menace. "Caleb," he offered no more. Just Caleb. The name was as spare and solid as the man himself. She looked from his unwavering eyes to the vast, empty landscape visible through the station's window. There was nothing here, only the cold, the hunger, and the creeping certainty of her own demise. His offer, impossible as it seemed, was the only door that had opened in weeks, perhaps the only one that ever would. Felt reckless, terrifying, illogical, but the alternative was certain despair. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took his. His grip was firm, warm, utterly steady. It wasn't the solicitous touch of a rescuer, nor the rough grab of a captor. It was simply a hand, offered with purpose. As she rose stiffly from the bench, Caleb didn't pull her, but waited patiently. He picked up her small, empty satchel, little more than a bundle of rags, without comment. He didn't smile, didn't offer false reassurance. He simply turned and walked towards the door, assuming correctly that she would follow. She did, her legs shaky, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, stepping out of the desolate station and into the biting wind alongside a man who had seen her at her lowest and declared, without explanation or condition, that she was coming with him. The journey was a blur of cold wind, monotonous landscape, and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Eleanor rode behind Caleb on a sturdy mare, holding onto the back of his saddle. He didn't speak, didn't offer conversation. He simply guided the horses with quiet competence, his back a solid, silent wall in front of her. At first, her fear was a physical presence, a knot in her stomach. She watched his profile, trying to read something, anything, in the set of his jaw, the lines around his eyes. Was he taking her to be a servant? A captive? What could a man like this possibly want with a woman like her? An old woman used up and broken? But as the hours wore on, a different sensation began to emerge. The sheer physical effort of riding, of enduring the cold, pushed the sharp edge off her terror, leaving a dull exhaustion. And beneath the exhaustion, a tentative, fragile sense of safety. It was the small things. When they stopped for water at a creek, he handed her the canteen first, watching her drink before taking his own. He didn't rush her. When they made camp for the night, just before darkness fully consumed the plains, he didn't build a grand fire that might attract unwanted attention, but a small, efficient one, sheltered from the wind. He gave her his bedroll, thin though it was, insisting he preferred the ground near the fire. He shared his meager rations of dried meat and hardtack without complaint, dividing it equally. He didn't stare at her as she ate, didn't ask questions about where she'd come from or how she'd ended up at the station. He simply existed alongside her in the quiet vastness, a presence that was both formidable and, in its strange way, comforting. His silence wasn't dismissive. It felt respectful, as if he understood she had little desire to speak, and perhaps much to forget. She watched him tend the fire, his movements economical and practiced. He seemed entirely at home in this harsh environment, a part of the landscape itself. It was a stark contrast to her own feeling of utter displacement. Yet, observing him, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of competence, of capability, embodied by another. He wasn't soft, not by any means. His hands were rough, his face weathered, his eyes watchful. But there was no cruelty in him. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of the night wind, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of the horses. It was a shared silence, a quiet acknowledgement of mutual existence in this isolated pocket of the world. As she lay wrapped in his bedroll, the warmth a surprising luxury, she found her rigid fear beginning to loosen, replaced by a deep, bone-weary relief. He hadn't forced her, hadn't threatened her. He had simply offered a path and let her choose. The thought, hesitant at first, then growing in strength, was this. Perhaps he saw something in her that she herself had forgotten existed. The beauty he had spoken of, if indeed he had meant her and not some phantom of his own mind, must lie deeper than the ravaged surface. Perhaps he saw the resilience forged by years of hardship, the quiet strength that had kept her going even when everything was lost. Or perhaps he simply saw a human being in desperate need and acted on a basic impulse of shared humanity, something increasingly rare in the world she knew. Whatever his reasons, she was here, safe from the immediate threats of the station. The future remained in uncertain territory, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel entirely without possibility. Sleep eventually claimed her, the crackling fire and the silent presence of the stranger standing watch a fragile, but real, barrier against the vast, indifferent night. She slept deeper than she had in weeks. They reached his place late the next afternoon. It was not a ranch, not even a homestead in the traditional sense. It was a cabin, small and solid, built into the side of a low ridge overlooking a wide, empty valley. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a welcoming sight. It was isolated, miles from any town, a lonely speck against the immense sky. Inside, it was simple but clean and orderly. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs the centerpiece. A narrow cot was built into an alcove. It smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. It was a man's dwelling, functional and sparse, but it had a quiet dignity about it. Caleb set down his bag and rifle. "It's not much," he said, his voice matter-of-fact. "But it's warm." He didn't make a fuss. He simply went about his tasks, unsaddling the horses, bringing in wood, starting a meal of beans and salt pork over the fire. Eleanor stood awkwardly by the door, unsure what to do, where to be. The silence felt different here, less like the protective shield of the trail, and more like the quiet hum of a life lived in solitude. She felt an urge to make herself useful, to prove she wasn't just a burden. She moved to the table, running a finger over the smooth wood. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He paused, looking at her. His gaze was assessing again, but this time it seemed to hold a question. He nodded slowly. "You can set the table. Cups are on the shelf." Setting 2 tin cups on the table felt like an immense act, a small claiming of space in this man's solitary world. As they ate, again in silence, she watched him. He ate slowly, deliberately. He didn't look at her often, but she felt his awareness of her presence. The meal was simple, but it was hot and filling, the best she had eaten in weeks. When they finished, she started to clear the dishes. He didn't stop her. It was a small routine, a familiar rhythm in an utterly unfamiliar place, and it grounded her slightly. Later, he gestured to a small stack of folded blankets near the hearth. "You can sleep there," he said. "It's the warmest spot," he pointed to the cot. "I'll take that." He was giving her the best spot, the cot in the journey replaced by the warmest spot near the fire here. It was another small act, but significant. She settled down, the blankets rough but warm. She watched him as he banked the fire, his movements efficient and quiet. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask anything about her past. It was as if he had accepted her entirely as she was, here and now, without history or explanation. And she, in turn, knew nothing of him, save his name and the quiet strength of his character. It was a strange foundation for a relationship, built on silence and action rather than words. But perhaps, given the fragility of words in a world that had used them to deceive and wound, it was a stronger one. The next morning, she woke before him. The cabin was still and dim, save for the glowing embers in the hearth. She rose quietly, finding a bucket by the door. Outside, the air was crisp and cold. She found the well and, with effort, drew water, the rope rough against her hands. She washed her face and hands, the cold water shocking but invigorating. She caught her reflection in the bucket, still tired, still lined, but perhaps a little less haunted than the face that had stared out from the station window. She saw the faint echo of the woman she used to be. As she stood there, drying her hands on her skirt, Caleb emerged from the cabin. He stopped, watching her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he simply nodded and went to tend to the horses. Later, he brought her a simple, faded dress, clean and mended, much too large for her slight frame, but a luxury compared to the filthy rags she wore. He also placed a bar of lye soap and a basin of warm water on the table. "You can wash up properly," he said, and then, turning away with a rare awkwardness, added, "There's no one to see you here." The words were practical, but the gesture felt profoundly kind. Days turned into weeks. They settled into a quiet routine. He hunted, trapped, worked the small plot of land he cultivated. She kept the cabin, cooked the simple meals, mended clothes, tended a small patch she started for herbs. There was still little conversation. Questions felt intrusive, answers unnecessary. They communicated through shared tasks, quiet gestures, the rhythm of their days. She learned to anticipate his needs, he hers. He noticed when her hands ached from the cold and showed her how to wrap them. She noticed the slight limp he favored after a long day and made sure his supper was hot. He still didn't speak of why he had brought her here, and she didn't ask. She was here. She was safe. She was no longer hungry or adrift. That was enough. The initial fear had long since dissipated, replaced by a quiet comfort and a deep, unspoken gratitude. She saw the isolated life he led, the hard work, the solitude, and she knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that she was no longer a burden, but a companion, a partner in this remote existence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, a sudden, sharp sound broke the quiet. A coyote's mournful cry, closer than usual, then another, and the distinct bleating of a distressed ewe. Caleb was instantly on alert, his body tensing. He kept a small flock of sheep, his main source of income. He grabbed his rifle, his movements swift and purposeful. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. Eleanor's heart pounded. She knew the dangers of this place, the predators, both animal and human. She watched him go, a wave of familiar helplessness threatening to engulf her. But then she looked around the small cabin, the life they had built together in this quiet space. She was not the woman shivering on the station bench. This was her home now, and his sheep were part of it. She grabbed the poker from the hearth, its weight surprisingly solid in her hand. She wouldn't just sit and wait. Opening the door a crack, she saw his form disappear into the darkness towards the sheep pen. The sounds of the coyotes grew louder, more frenzied. She hesitated for only a moment, then slipped outside, keeping low, moving towards the pen. The cold air bit at her, but adrenaline coursed through her veins. She could see shadowy shapes darting near the enclosure. Caleb was there, shouting, firing a warning shot. One bold coyote lunged. Eleanor didn't think. She ran towards the pen, banging the metal poker against a discarded bucket, yelling, making as much noise as she could. It was a small, insignificant act against wild nature, but it added to the chaos, the unexpected human presence deterring the predators. The coyotes scattered, fading back into the darkness. Caleb turned, his eyes wide with surprise. Then something else, a flicker of respect. She stood there, breathless, the poker still clutched in her hand. "I told you to stay inside," he said, his voice gruff but lacking anger. I couldn't," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. This is our home." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not an old woman, not a rescued waif, but a partner, standing with him against the night. A small, hesitant smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen. It transformed his stoic face. Later, back inside, the cabin felt warmer, safer. The threat had passed, but something fundamental had shifted. The quiet between them was no longer just comfortable. It was companionable, intimate in its shared resilience. He looked at her across the firelight, his gaze steady and clear. "You're not just someone I found," he said, choosing his words carefully. You're Eleanor." He finally used her name, a quiet acknowledgement of her identity, her personhood. She nodded, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "And you are Caleb." The names, simple as they were, felt like a quiet vow. She had come to him broken and afraid, an old woman with nothing left. He had seen past the surface, recognized something durable within her, and offered her not charity, but a place, a partnership. And in doing so, he had not only saved her life, but restored her dignity, allowing the resilient spirit she thought was long buried to rise again. They were two solitary people, brought together by chance and hardship, forging a life in the wilderness, finding strength and quiet beauty in each other's presence. Two souls no longer adrift, but anchored together by a bond deeper than words.